Well, thank you, folks. I know we've got a few more people who are going to be trickling in and whatnot, but guys, these people have to tell us about a 12,000-mile trip, so I don't really want to waste a minute. I don't want to miss any of it. It sounds pretty interesting right off the bat. So I want to give you just a brief amount of background on Amy and Dave Freeman. I don't know if you've seen their bio in the brochure and whatnot, but basically they're into adventure travel, and we want people like them to start spending money in the Huron Watershed Council and also be turning on their friends to how wonderful it is here. So the bottom line is they're going to tell you about what's on the map. Their odyssey began, yesterday was Earth Day. Their odyssey began about 3 years ago on Earth Day, so it's a great opportunity to be talking about this. And they started by kayaking along the Pacific coast, studying temperate rainforest, marine life of the Pacific Northwest, and then they had a 6-stage journey to cover all of North America's wildest places. So they covered about 1,400 miles from Seattle, Washington, up to Skagway, Alaska. And, that's not very far into Alaska, by the way, if you're not very familiar with how the maps work there. You don't get deep into Alaska, even when you go 1,400 miles. They progressed over history-studded mountains in the footsteps of the Klondike Gold Rush, the home of the Inuit along the Arctic Ocean, where there's polar bears. And from the Arctic, you can see they dog-sledded and canoed through central Canada, kayaked across the Great Lakes, and Dave and Amy also followed the annual whale migration past the salt marshes and sea turtles of the Atlantic coast, finally completing their journey in the mangroves and coral reefs of the Florida Keys in April of 2013. So I'll let them give any other background to kind of this story, why they did it, what they saw. Without any further fanfare, I'd like to introduce Amy and Dave Freeman to tell us all about it.
Thank you very much. Well, we're really excited to be here today. We've heard a lot of numbers and statistics about the watershed, and that's really important. But our story is a little bit more at the heart of it. We love looking at maps, and basically we wanted to figure out how we could tie together wild places by following oceans and lakes and rivers and streams across North America. From the Arctic to the Everglades and everywhere in between, and try to give a voice to these wild places. And we spent 3 years doing it, starting in 2010 on Earth Day and finishing very close to Earth Day in 2013. But first we had to get married. So about a month before we took off, we gathered our closest friends and family near our home in northern Minnesota, and we celebrated our wedding, and then we'd take off on what some people called a really long honeymoon. And we would travel 11,700 miles, but rather than using cars or planes or trains, we wanted to do it under our own power. So we were traveling by kayak, by canoe, and by dog sled. Because when you travel at 3 or 4 or 5 miles an hour, you experience a landscape in a way that's very different than if we're traveling at 60 miles an hour down the highway. And we wanted to see the landscape change at a very slow rate and get to know these landscapes. We didn't want to just do this for ourselves. We wanted to try and interact with students all over the country and share our experiences with them. And so we brought some things along with us that you wouldn't normally think of bringing on a canoe trip or a kayak ride. Oh, sorry. I'll just use the other one. Okay. Is that better? Okay. Thanks for letting me know. So we brought some things along that you wouldn't normally think of. Computers, solar panels, satellite terminals, so that we could share our journey. And we had about 85,000 students from 600 elementary and middle schools all across the country that would join us. Every day we would upload photos and videos and information, scientific data, to teach them about these places and why they were important. Our introduction to wild places started a long time ago. And we slowly built up to the place where we would take on a journey across the continent. And for me, my first experience in a canoe was actually right here. I lived in Ann Arbor for a few years as a young child, and my first memory of being in a canoe was what my family calls the mighty Huron. And as a 4- and 5-year-old, I can remember my parents and my twin sister and I going on canoe trips down the Huron River and stopping for apple cider and looking for hippopotamus and alligators in the water. And I've heard that the water quality has improved over the last 30 years, so I figured there are probably more hippos than there were back in 1980. But one of the reasons why our local lakes and rivers and streams are so important is because this is often the first introduction to nature and wild places that young people experience. And if we don't expose students to the outdoor world when they're young, they're not going to develop an appreciation for it as they get older. And they won't understand why protecting and improving our lakes, rivers, and streams is so important. Now, during our journey, we camped in over 700 locations across the continent. And each image that we show you represents about 10 days of travel. So it's hard to compress this into, 50 minutes. But we're going to do our best to try and share with you some of the highlights of our journey by water across North America. About 98% of our travel was done on water, whether it was frozen and we were traveling over it in a dog sled, or whether we were paddling along the Pacific coast or following lakes and rivers and streams through the interior of the continent. 98% of that. We have this amazing network of watersheds that allows us to travel all across the continent. I think one of the most rewarding things about our journey was that every day we would wake up in a new place. Sometimes if we had a long day, we would literally set up camp in the dark. And so when the sun rose the next morning, that was our first chance to see the beautiful landscape. And sort of wondering what's around the next bend. That's sort of what kept us going.
Well, back to the journey itself. So we started near Bellingham, Washington, and paddled up the Inside Passage along the Pacific coast. And the mountains just dropped right into the water. We paddled along temperate rainforest. I remember at first realizing that I had sort of an issue with judging distance, because I was used to paddling in Minnesota, where we have a lot of black spruce trees and some white pines and stuff, and here we have the giant trees of the Pacific Northwest. So I would see an island a little ways, what I thought was a little ways away, and 2 hours later we're still not anywhere near it. But just an amazing place to paddle. And the life in the ocean was a thrill for us to see. So things like the sea lions and the seals, and then the smaller things along shore too, like sea stars. I loved paddling right in the intertidal zone and just staring at the shore and just underneath the surface of the water. It's just mesmerizing. And there were some larger creatures too. Humpback whales came within 15 feet of us in our kayaks. We were rather awestruck by these creatures. We had seen them off in the distance feeding, and we had actually paused to pull out our cameras and getting ready for some, telephoto long-distance shots. And sure enough, a couple whales actually swam towards us, and we just sort of froze, And I said to Dave, "What do we do? Do you think they see us?" I thought, maybe they were just kind of going along the surface and going to plow right into us. But they were coming over to check us out. And we just sat there on the surface. It felt like an hour just to be in the presence of these massive creatures. But really, it was probably a minute or two that they sat there, and we could hear the massive creatures breathing. We were paddling with a friend at the time who was a little farther away, and he told us that from where he was, he could see the eyeball of one of the whales, and it was actually focused on us. Just amazing creatures there. So we headed north, continuing along the coast, in the presence of some really cool glaciers and icebergs, and things got colder as we went north. And then we headed inland when we reached Skagway. So we followed in the path of the Klondike Gold Rush, heading over the Chilkoot Trail, which they call the world's longest museum because you find artifacts from the gold rush. You know, people who had to haul thousands of pounds of supplies over this trail discarded things along the way. So we saw soles of shoes and saw blades and wood stoves and even kind of the remnants of wooden canvas boats right at the top of the pass. Just a really neat place to hike. And we made it to the Yukon River and then continued by water, so paddling from there to Dawson. And at Dawson we switched to hiking, where we hiked through Tombstone Territorial Park. And this is a massive area where we really didn't see any signs of people anywhere. So, you know, we could stand up high in a place like this and look around and not see any roads or lights or telephone lines, just nothing. And it was interesting traveling by hiking instead of by water. You know, suddenly all of our equipment we have to have on our backs, and progress was painfully slow. There aren't trails here. We were just figuring out our route on the map, GPS, and looking across these valleys. So, you know, we might have camped here the night before, and our progress was just to get to this point by the next day. So maybe we made it a distance of 5 miles over the course of a day. Just really, really challenging work for us. And this taught us one of the important lessons that we learned throughout the course of this trip. And that was the need to, well, you know, it's good to have a big goal. We had this big goal of going from Bellingham to Key West by way of the Arctic, and you know, we were looking forward to Key West, but when the going got hard in times like this, we really couldn't think about Key West because that was just too far down the line. We had to sort of put the big goal aside and really look at the challenge that we faced that day, or the challenge that we faced over the course of the next 15 minutes as we trudged through a bog or we scrambled to get up to the ridge line. So I hope you take that to heart if you're working to achieve a goal, you know, whatever it may be in your life, that if the going gets hard, it really works to break it down into manageable steps. And so for us, it may have been, you know, okay, we'll keep walking for the next 15 minutes and then we'll take a water break. And we saw some interesting creatures in this part of the journey too. This moose happened to be kind of in our path. We saw this pond up ahead as we were trudging through a boggy spot, and Dave was ahead a little ways. He saw the moose. He whispered to me, "Amy, get out the camera. There's a moose up ahead." And so we got kind of quiet. We're trying to sneak up on the moose, and we saw brown fur behind a tree just to the side of us, like 10 feet away or so. And our first thought was, wow, there's another moose really close to us. But then the animal poked its head out from behind the tree, and it happened to be a grizzly bear. So I apologize, we don't have a picture of the bear. But, you know, we paused and just sort of talked to the bear, let it know we were people, and the bear was as scared as we were. He kind of made a huffing noise and ran away. And then we continued to walk by this moose and got a picture of him. But the funny thing is, you know, in all of our travels, like, people assume the bears are the most dangerous, when really the moose probably presented more of a threat because he was not going to give up his spot in the pond. He turned to face us the whole time we were skirting around his pond.
Things can change really quickly. When we were trudging over those mountains, we were going 4 or 5 miles a day, back-breaking work. We made it to the headwaters of the Blackstone River, which empties into the Peel, and it was in full flood. There had been a huge rainstorm, and we got back in our canoe with a month's worth of supplies that had been dropped off for us, and we could literally watch the river just drop in front of us, and we traveled 90 miles on the first day. It felt like we were riding in a car. We were going so fast. I mean, after trudging along at a third of a mile an hour for so long. And we went through these beautiful landscape. You can see these big gray mountains. This was an area that was called Beringia during the last ice age. Even though it's way up in the northern Canada and the Yukon, these little pockets of mountains were not covered by the glaciers. They didn't scour away these mountains. And so they left this very unique geologic formation. And you can actually find mammoth tusks and bones and things like that sticking out of the mountainside because they weren't scoured away. And slowly we followed this river down, down, down. It got bigger and bigger. And we would spend about a month traveling from the headwaters of the Peel to the Mackenzie River and to the Mackenzie River Delta. And during that time, we didn't pass any roads or any towns, just a wild landscape. And here we are, we had a challenge where we had to portage around this big Class 6 rapids. And so we spent a full day trudging through the brush for about 4 miles. And at the end of the day, we sort of collapsed exhausted in this spot where Amy's sitting. And the next day we woke up in the morning and we realized that basically we had reached the end. 100 yards after our campsite, we came to a spot where we could make our way back down to the river and continue paddling again. And when we loaded our canoe at the bottom of this canyon, there were just hundreds of foot vertical cliffs that just went up on the sides of the river. It's just an amazing place. Other canyons along the river had small rapids in them, so we could paddle right through, and we would go for miles through these sheer cliffs, cliff-walled canyons, and just a magical, magical place. And then we had sort of a shift. We were going downstream for so long, but when we reached the Mackenzie River Delta, we had to start working our way south. And the Mackenzie is sort of like the Mississippi River. It's a big, slow, muddy river. And at this point, we had to work our way for about 500 miles upstream. So rather than traveling downstream at sometimes, 80 miles a day, all of a sudden we were forced to go upstream. And our progress slowed to a crawl. We were only going 10 or 15 miles a day. And it really made us have to sort of rethink how we were doing things, because the same amount of effort, instead of taking us, 20, 30, 40 miles, we were only doing 10 or 15. And it was easy to sort of get discouraged. But what we found was that if we could sort of get ourselves to slow down, we actually could notice a lot of really interesting things along the river, because we spent about a third of the time paddling, a third of the time lining, which is like this, where basically we're walking along shore just sort of pulling the canoe, and a third of the time sailing, which is where we would paddle, but we also had a tailwind so we could put up a little sail to make it a little bit easier. And because we had to stay right along shore, whether we were walking or whether we were paddling out of the current right along shore, it made us experience things in a much different way than if we had been going downriver. At this time of the year, it was fall. We were losing 12 minutes of daylight a day. The bears were stocking up for winter. The animals were getting ready to hibernate or migrate south. It was starting to snow. We'd been traveling for 5 months. We were getting a little bit crazy. At least I was. Amy was holding it together. And this really was a time where we had to make a switch. We couldn't paddle any further. Everything was freezing up around us. And so we would switch from canoeing to dog sledding. And we would follow this blue line for 900 miles with our dog team across the Northwest Territories.
We added a couple team members, so we had a group of 4 dog sledding. But there were some furry team members that we added too. So we had a dozen sled dogs with us. And these sled dogs came from different places. Most of them came from a friend of ours in Ely, Minnesota, but then we added 4 Malamutes from Ashland, Wisconsin. And there were a couple dogs that we personally owned. So the couple who joined us, they own this dog, Cirrus. And then the one who looks different than all the others, Dave and I own this guy. This is Fennel. He's half sled dog, half black lab. He made a great lead dog, by the way. But we brought all these dogs from different backgrounds together and trained them and got them to function as a team. So when we started out along the Mackenzie River, this is what it looked like. We had kind of a narrow band that we could follow where the going was pretty easy, where we were in between this steep bank on one side with rocks and jumbled ice in the middle. But it was pretty smooth going. We had limited daylight. The days were really short. And when we started, imagine the sun rising around 10 a.m. and then setting at 4 p.m. Not much daylight to work with. And it was quite cold. So this is what a typical camp would look like. We had one big tent. You can see the stovepipe coming out, so we'd heat the space. It was really a good chance to dry out our clothing, and then also we would cook over that stove. And then the sled dogs are staked around the camp. Now, I mentioned cold. I didn't say specifics. So imagine like 50 below on a regular basis at night, and maybe it would warm up to like 45 below during the day. And a good indicator of really cold weather is your dog team steaming like this. So this was a very cold morning when, there was basically like a cloud of frost around the sled dogs from their breath and their body heat. So we had to wear special clothes to keep ourselves warm during this time, and we would alternate between skiing and dog sledding. So 2 people would be mushing on the dog sleds every day, and 2 people would be skiing. One day we encountered a blizzard. So this was on Great Bear Lake, and just total whiteout conditions. We had a crossing to make of a bay, so we had 12 miles to go across just into this total void, just whiteness. And we decided as a team to go for it because we kind of, we figured this was still within our realm of capability. We were going to be safe about it. We knew what we were doing. The weather was actually a little warmer and we had a tailwind, so we kind of assessed the risk and decided, okay, yes, we'll do this. It was a challenge and it kind of pushed our comfort zones, but it was a good day in all. And I have a little video clip I'll show just how windy it was.
So, on the back of our arm on Great Bear Lake.
So we had the 2 dog teams. That was the first one and then the second one. And we actually had the skiers. Partway through our crossing, we attached the skiers to the dog teams as well. So it was like one more dog working to pull the sleds across. I was skiing that day, so that was me in front of that team. But with the dog sledding, it just taught us the value of teamwork, the importance of kind of getting along with all the people you're working with. So whether it's sled dogs or various organizations working together, if you can have a good relationship and get along, you'll be cooperating, you'll collaborate, you'll get things done. And if you're doing something like this, it doesn't work too well. See, Sirius is arguing with Domino and the sled is just not going anywhere. So it's important, and when you're all working together, you can achieve a lot.
I think when we started this journey, we were really excited about the landscapes, the waterways, the sheer wilderness that we were going to encounter. And one of the things that sort of caught us off guard were the people. And I want to tell a little bit of a story about this guy. This man's name is Edwin, and probably the first thing you're wondering is, what the heck is that thing that he's holding? It's a frozen otter. Edwin's a trapper. And one day we were dog sledding along. It was quite cold, and I saw this old Eland snowmobile come out, puttering out across the lake. And we hadn't seen anybody in about 10 days. We thought, wow, this is cool. Let's go see what's going on with this guy. And he disappeared back into the woods, and we left the dog sled out on the lake, and I followed him up this trail. And right before I got to him, he gets back on his snowmobile, and he comes puttering right back past me. I mean, the trail's like 4 feet wide. I have to step out of his way, and I'm waving, and it's just like I'm not even there, He just... So I turn around on my skis and start going back the other way, and I almost get to him, and he gets back on his snowmobile. He comes blazing by me, and I'm like, hi, nothing. So I go back sort of dejected, and we dog sled around this point, and there he is. He's down on the ice, and we dog sled right up to him, and doesn't even look up. He just says, "Your dogs must be hungry." And he starts throwing, 5-pound chunks of frozen fish to all of our dogs. And we start talking to him, and we're only able to visit for a few minutes, but we sort of gather that he's an elder, he's a trapper. He spends most of his time out on the land, and his village is about a 5-day dog sled from where we are. And so it's getting dark, and we have to go find a place to camp, and so we sort of part ways. But before we leave, he says, "When you get to my town, come find me." And so, 5 or 6 days later, we come into town, and we look him up, and he invites us in, and he's really excited because 30 years ago, the only way that people traveled in the winter was by dog sled. And over the course of about 10 years, it switched from dog sleds to snowmobiles, and all the dogs were gone. A town of 300 people would have had 1,000 sled dogs, and now there might be 10, maybe. And so he cooked us this huge feast with a turkey and mashed potatoes and all this stuff, and he also made a smoked beaver, which is sort of a local delicacy. And if you haven't tried beaver before, it tastes sort of like wood, which is what they eat. But we spent a couple days in this community with Edwin, and one day we were sitting there, and I noticed Edwin had this sort of sad look. And I just asked him, what are you thinking about, Edwin? And he just said, "My people are lost." He said, "Everyone is driving around in their trucks and their snowmobiles. They can't hear the land." He said, "When you travel by dog team, you see every rock, every tree. The land speaks to you. You can hear the land. And my people have lost that." And I realized that was a lot of the reason why we had taken off on this journey, was because when you travel at 3, 4, 5 miles an hour, you experience things in such a different way. And in our daily lives, when we're, bustling around in our cars and our trains and we're insulated in our houses, it's so easy to lose touch with the natural world around us, and lose touch with how important pristine lakes and rivers and natural ecosystems are. They're so critical to our lives and healthy communities. And he really sort of sent that point home for me. So again, we had another switch. We had to switch from dog sledding back to paddling. And we would spend the next 5 months canoeing from Great Slave Lake here back to Lake Superior. And through our website, Wilderness Classroom, kids vote. They decide where we go and what we do. They make decisions for us. And one of the decisions that they made was what we should do with Fennel. Fennel was our lead dog. He was half black lab and half sled dog. And at 13 years old, he led us across the Northwest Territories. He's been to hundreds of schools, and he's sort of a rock star. But students voted, and they decided he was ready to retire, and so we should bring him with us for 5 months, canoeing across Canada. We weighed him afterwards. He weighs 104 pounds, or at least that's how much he weighed at the end. But we made a little spot for him, and he became a big part of the journey. When we started paddling, it was late May, and 90% of Great Slave Lake was still covered in ice. But we had a long way to go before freeze up, and so we had to just sort of get started. And we worked our way for the first 50 miles through these giant pans of ice. And eventually we were able to leave Great Slave Lake and start working our way up and down lakes and streams and rivers, slowly heading southeast across the continent. And here it was July, and we would still find little tidbits of snow and ice. This was a very wild place. We traveled for 42 days between towns, carrying all of our supplies with us. And for hundreds of miles, we would portage like this with no real sign of trails or human habitation of any kind. We didn't have room for 42 days worth of food and all of our supplies and a 104-pound sled dog and 42 days worth of dog food. It didn't fit. We tried. So what we decided to do was we decided that we would catch fish for Fennel, and we fed him fish for the whole summer. And he quickly learned that as soon as we had our fishing rod out, it was almost time for dinner, and he'd come and sit right next to us. The hardest part was teaching him that he had to wait for us to take the fish off the hook before it was time to eat it. Seem to have come to a spot where there's a forest fire burning right along our path. That's where we're headed. Looks a little bit smoky. So one day we were paddling along and we smelled smoke. And we came around this corner and we saw this fire off in the distance. And we weren't quite sure what to do because it was literally right where we were trying to go. Just down this really long, skinny lake, which was basically a wide, slow-flowing river. And so we just sat on the sandbar for about 4 hours, and we just slowly watched this fire get closer and closer and closer until it just filled the other side of the river. It was about 1/8 of a mile away from us. And you could feel the heat. It was like standing by a little campfire, that radiant heat, but yet the fire was, 1/8 of a mile away. And the flames were shooting way up in the sky. And 5 minutes after we took this picture, it looked like this. The fire was still burning, but it had burned past this spot, and it had jumped the river, and it just sort of showed us this raw power of nature. We can't really fight nature. We have to work with it. And for me, this really hit home when we were watching this forest fire, because there was nothing that we could do except get out of its way. And we weren't sure what to do at this point, so we got on our satellite phone and we called basically the Canadian equivalent of the Forest Service, because they're the ones that deal with the forest fires. And we told them where we were, and there was this really long pause, and then the guy said, "Oh, I thought that fire was in Saskatchewan." And we're like, well, we're fairly close to Saskatchewan, but we're in the Northwest Territories. And this is a huge fire. And they didn't even know where it was, It just taught us sort of the vastness of this area. Up there, if a fire isn't within like 30 or 40 miles of a town, it doesn't matter how big it is. They don't really, it's just there. It's just doing its thing. And so it was a really interesting landscape to travel through. And after we saw this fire, we started really noticing how fire affected the landscape. We would see areas that had burned, and we could sort of speculate, oh, I bet that was like 5 years ago. Oh, I bet that one was 25 years ago. You could see different areas, but most of the area had burned in the last 50 years or 75 years. And we started to really see that, our eyes opened to it as we sort of traveled slowly through the landscape. And slowly we worked our way up and down a series of lakes and rivers, and we got to this river. This is called the Fond du Lac River. And we had to go about 250 miles up this river. It was really slow going. I think this was a point, it was a beautiful place, but it was also a point where we were sort of like, man, what the heck are we doing, Like, we're like not even halfway yet, and this is getting crazy, We're spending days wading up rapids, What's gonna come of this? But I think we tried to just tried to stay really positive and just I think we always believed that we could do it, and the thought of stopping just didn't really enter our minds, you know? We didn't really let ourselves think about that. We just were thinking about, well, how can we wade up these rapids, and then we'll worry about the next one. We use solar power to gather all of our power was to run our computers and our satellite terminals and cameras, and we just lay it out on top of the dog sled or on top of the canoe. And we just sort of slowly worked our way along. And up until this point, we were about halfway through with our journey. Everything hadn't gone as planned, but, we've been able to travel under our own power, halfway across the continent, 5,000 miles, something like that, 6,000 miles. And then we had a problem. We had to switch from the Churchill River watershed to the Nelson River watershed that would flow into Lake Winnipeg. And we had this 30-mile long portage that we had to do over a road, and we had this really cool wheeled cart, and we had it all figured out. And we went about 10 miles, and then we got to the point where we basically were a really long way from any water, and the wheel just collapsed. The cart totally broke. There was nothing we can do. And so we're left there sitting on the side of the road, a long ways from anything, on this really long road with no towns or anything around, and we're like, what the heck are we going to do? This is definitely not part of the plan. And this pickup truck comes along and stops. They're going the opposite way, and these guys get out and ask us what's going on. They're a little confused about a canoe in the middle of the road. And the guy looks at us, and he looks at our dog, and you can see the wheel sort of churn in his head, and he says, have you ever been to Cross Lake before? And Cross Lake's this little town of 1,000 native people up in northern Manitoba. And I say, yeah, I dog sledded through there about 8 years ago. And he said, I recognize your dog. I'm the lawyer. And the lawyer is his nickname because he's good at arguing or something. But I'd met this guy 8 years ago when I dog sledded through his town, and we started talking and remembered, oh yeah, we had dinner, whatever. And so before long, we're loading the canoe and all of our stuff in the back of their pickup truck, and they're driving us 20 miles so we could get to a place where we could, keep going on our journey. And, one of the main things setting out, one of our main goals was we wanted to do this all under our own power. And here we were at this point where it was like we were stuck, and we sort of had to get help. And did it totally ruin everything we were doing because we had to rely on something? I don't think so. I mean, now we have this great story about this person that I reconnected with. And the rest of our journey, we kept going. So we had this big goal, but occasionally you have to sort of reevaluate and sort of take things as they come. And this is sort of an example of that. The lawyer gave us this flag, and the one thing that he asked was that we stuck it in the front of the canoe and sort of took his flag the rest of the way. So we made a little spot for it in our canoe. And we headed down Lake Winnipeg, which is this 350-mile-long lake in Manitoba. It's a beautiful lake, sand beaches and very undeveloped. The east side of the lake has about 200 miles where there are no roads, very remote, just a couple native communities. And we were hundreds of miles from a road. And we started seeing this sort of film on the water. And we paddled into a town and to try and figure out what was going on. And they told us that this was blue-green algal blooms. And that basically what was happening is, even though there wasn't really any industry or development or even lawns or anything here, hundreds of miles away to the south where the Winnipeg River flows into the lake, it was bringing all these nutrients, and it was causing these algal blooms that would cover hundreds and hundreds of miles of this lake. This lake that has a total population living around it of a few thousand people, except for the very southern tip. And it made us realize that you guys are working on improving and protecting this watershed. But it's not just going to help you, it's helping everybody downstream as well. These people weren't causing this pollution. They were being affected by everything that was downstream or upstream of them. And so I think there's a lot of good in what you guys are doing, not just for your communities here, but everybody in the Great Lakes watershed, because they're going to see benefits from the preservation that's going on in this watershed.
So continuing on our journey, we reached what I consider kind of my favorite part of it, and that's because we were basically paddling through our home area, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And we hit there in the fall. It was late October, and here the tamaracks are changing to their lovely golden color. It was just a great time to be there, a time when there aren't as many other people out in canoes, so we would just have, lakes, campsites to ourselves, and some gorgeous foggy mornings, when the water temperature is warmer than the cold air. And it was just... It felt really good kind of coming to a place that we were familiar with, right in the middle of this long journey and at the end of one of the stages of the journey. So this happened on our last night of this stage. We were camped at the top of Grand Portage, which is about a 9-mile long portage that you have to do to get down to Lake Superior. It's what the voyageurs would do with their furs and trade goods. And so we were kind of mentally preparing for that and sitting around the campfire reminiscing about how great the summer and fall had been, and happened to notice this green glow in the sky. And a few minutes later, the sky just erupted in color, and we saw the best display of northern lights we've ever seen. I mean, all this time we spent in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, we saw a lot of northern lights, but nothing compared to this night. Just the whole sky was covered in color. We'd never seen red before. It was just amazing. I should mention we had a friend with us who's a professional photographer, so he took those shots of the northern lights, Brian Hansel. And the next morning, I guess a little more about the northern lights. It was sort of like Mother Nature, giving her farewell to us, because it was our last night camping out on the trail before we would take this long break. So the next morning we hiked down the Grand Portage and made it to the shore of Lake Superior, and there we would stop for a little while. We paused for the winter because we knew, it was the end of October. We really didn't want to paddle on Lake Superior in November, considering Edmund Fitzgerald. So we guided dog sledding trips in Minnesota for the summer, or for the winter, and then we took off on Lake Superior in kayaks the following spring. So this is our transition point. Here we would switch to the kayaks, do the north shore of Lake Superior, and then out to the east coast. So in May, we started out on Lake Superior, and again, it was like being home, like paddling in our backyard, because Dave and I had kayaked around the lake in 2006, so this shoreline was very familiar to us. And the cold, clear water of Lake Superior, just a great place to be. We made our way along like the Canadian shore, a very rugged stretch of shoreline, lots of islands and bays, and just great places to be, great places to paddle. This is in Puckasaw National Park. And then we made our way past Sault Ste. Marie and into Georgian Bay, and we just worked our way out to the St. Lawrence, and then through a series of rivers to get into the Bay of Fundy. So we passed through Fort Kent, Maine, and a spot called Reversing Falls, which I think is a pretty cool place. So you probably know the Bay of Fundy has some of the world's largest tides. So there can be a tidal difference of 50 feet between high tide and low tide. Now, at this point in the bay, it's sort of in the middle, so it's maybe 25, 30 feet that the water changes. And so where the St. John River flows into the Bay of Fundy, there's this cool thing that happens. So imagine, the river is staying at a constant level, but then the tide is changing to be either higher or lower than the level of the river. And so for part of the day, you have a huge rapids that is actually flowing into the river. And then the tide, changes. At slack tide, it's actually calm and safe to paddle through. That was what we were waiting for. But you don't have much time to do it, because then as the tide drops, you have a huge rapids that comes out into the ocean from the river. So we booked it through during that calm stretch of time. It was just cool to actually, we got there, while the rapids were in full bore. We watched it, and then we saw it calm down and headed through. So, this really is like the same area from that to that. Pretty cool. And made our way into the Bay of Fundy. It was neat to witness that huge tidal difference. So there are big currents that are created, and the kind of thing where we really had to go with the flow, just go when the current was flowing the way we needed to travel, because if we tried to go against it, it just wouldn't work. It'd be like being on a treadmill. And we saw plenty of cool places like this where if we stopped for lunch here, it was like we were sitting on the bottom of the ocean and just seeing all the seaweed and barnacles and everything around. And we knew we couldn't stop here for long, because we could actually watch the water sort of rise coming up the beach. We'd have to move our kayaks if we stopped for more than 15 minutes. So we made our way down the coast.
And at this point, we're transitioning into another fall. The days are getting short. We're sort of feeling like the animals, the birds migrating south. You sort of feel this sense of urgency. We sort of feel like we've got to go. And we kept paddling south. And slowly we got into more sort of populated areas. It was a little harder to find places to camp. We love water trails and sort of established campsites, especially in more urban areas, because you can't experience these places if you don't have places to stop, to use the bathroom, to camp, to picnic, to access the water through parking lots and river access. And we really experienced that along the East Coast. The whole state of South Carolina only has one place that you can camp on it legally, and the whole Georgia coastline has no campsites for kayakers or canoers or paddlers at all. So I didn't even think Georgia had a coastline before we left, but they do. They actually have a really nice one. But the point is that water trails and other things that foster use are so important. Because oftentimes we found ourselves in instances like this, where there really wasn't any place for us to camp, and so we basically would just wait until it was dark, and then we'd sort of set up, and then right before the sun came up, we would leave. But you couldn't tell we were there. We would leave no trace. And it started getting really, really populated. We started seeing lots of boats. The boats started getting bigger. They got really big. Amy didn't like this one. She was like, "Come on, we gotta go. It's gonna run us over." But it was pretty cool. And we started paddling into really big cities. And in some ways you wonder, well, why would they do this? Why we were about experiencing all these wild places. Why would we decide to paddle down the East Coast? It's the most populated part of the country. And the reason was we wanted to be able to share our experience with others. And so as we reached New York City, we weren't really sure what we were going to do. And we had to paddle right down the East River, right past Manhattan. And we had to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to time the tides right. And we were paddling in what's sort of darkness near New York City. There's a lot of urban light pollution. And we went right past Manhattan, right past the Statue of Liberty, like right at rush hour. It sort of felt like being in a game of Frogger, because there were so many like ferries and boats and everything going all over the place, and we're just sort of bouncing up and down in our little kayaks. But all along the way, all along the East Coast, we would stop and do presentations in schools, and we met directly with over 25,000 kids during school programs over that 3-year period. So the last year was really about sharing our story. We wanted to go to these urban areas so that we would, encounter people, so we could tell them about these wild places that we'd experienced. One of the side effects of this is that we found amazing wild places, even in the most developed urban areas. 50 miles from New York City, we would find salt marshes and tidal creeks and little hummocks with trees, little pockets full of birds and crabs and fish. There's wild places everywhere. We just have to sort of find them and appreciate them and use them and share them with others so they'll do the same. Just south of New York City, we stopped to do a program, and after the program, the folks said, there's this storm coming, and you should probably stay with us because I think it's going to be a big one. And so we did, and it was Hurricane Sandy. And in the middle of the storm, we actually went outside, and it was totally calm, and the clouds cleared, and this huge full moon came out, and then 10 minutes later, 60-mile-an-hour winds from the opposite direction. The eye of the storm literally went right over us. And after the storm, we wanted to, this man has a kayak shop that was right on the coast, and he was really worried about it. So all the streets were flooded, and so we took some kayaks so we could paddle out to his shop to see what it looked like. And this is what we found. Just debris everywhere. And we spent about 5 days afterwards just sort of helping with the cleanup process. And then eventually, winter was coming. We had to keep going. So we said goodbye, and we headed south. And we talked to them. We went and visited them after we finished, a few months later, and they had rebuilt. They were getting ready to start the kayak season over again. And I think the thing that we took away from Hurricane Sandy was just how quickly people all around sort of stepped up. People that weren't as badly affected by the storm were, coming with shovels and tools, were dropping off coffee and food. Community is so powerful, and communities can make a huge difference. I mean, we need assistance on a national level, but there's so many things that start and end at the community level. And I think that's one of the things that's so exciting about seeing all of you here is that you are working to make, concrete improvements right here in your communities. And that is really, really important. Slowly we headed south. Everything was freezing now. It's December. It's getting cold. And I kept telling Amy that as soon as we get to South Carolina, it's going to be warm. And somehow the day we paddled across, it was like 10 degrees warmer. I think it was a fluke, but it was sort of neat to be trying to sort of beat the winter. We just sort of slowly kept going. It was like tortoise in the hare. And eventually we made it, down to Georgia and Florida where it was warm. And we started encountering all these amazing animals that we hadn't seen in the first 11,000 miles of our journey. Cypress swamps and all sorts of stuff. One of the coolest animals that we encountered were these manatees. And one morning we woke up and we were camped by this little freshwater spring. And overnight a family of 4 manatees had sort of floated in. They don't go very fast. And they were just sort of hanging out in this crystal clear water. So we were able to go in and sort of float around with them. But, we saw other animals as well. A lot of times people, I think when they think of this journey, they think of risk. And I think we really did take some risks when we set off on this journey. But I'm not talking about risks from alligators or bears or storms or rapids or things like that. I think the real risk that we took was selling our car and packing up all of our stuff and putting it in storage. And, telling my in-laws that we're leaving for 3 years to do this crazy thing across North America. Sort of putting ourselves out there, that we're gonna do this. Like, this is a dream that we have. And I think one of the things that we took away from this journey is the importance of really trying to put ourselves out there. Let's pick something that's not right in our comfort zone, but that's a little bit further, because when we do that, we can achieve things that aren't possible unless we take some calculated risks in case we sort of move out of that comfort zone a little bit. And the benefits for us were we got to see all these amazing things, birds and people and mountains. And eventually we paddled into Key West, and 3 years, and we pulled up on the beach, and there were 100 people there. None of them knew us. They were just sunbathing, but it didn't really matter. That wasn't why we were there. It just felt good to know that we had been working towards this for so long, and something that at the beginning seemed so impossible to do, we've been able to accomplish. So thank you so much for having us. We really enjoyed coming to talk with you.